has been a day like no other because Magnus Carlsen blundered. The world champion blundered in chess. When does that happen? Like never. I am here to show you the game and show you exactly how it happened. And this was round number 4 of Tata Steel Chess Masters. Magnus Carlsen was playing against Anish Giri, a super grandmaster from Netherlands that is actually known to draw a lot, but he's been having a fantastic chess tournament in Tata Steel. So the game started with d4, which is fantastic. I love d4. Knight f6, c4, and e6. And now knight f3, b6. Now this is a Queen's Indian defense where black simply, well, tries to fianchetto the bishop. And now actually Anish also played g3 to fianchetto his own bishop. So black went bishop a6. And we saw this, I think, in a previous round. Ding Liren played this theory. The idea is simply that you're threatening this pawn on c4, and now one of the main moves is to go b3 or to go queen c2, just like Anish did, simply defending the pawn. Now, in this position, you can do a few different moves with black, but Magnus played bishop b7, went back with the bishop, because the bishop in general is better placed here, and now he's basically saying that the queen is worse played on c2 than on d1, because he could have gone here immediately, but he went, you know, with this path. And one of the ideas for why the queen is better placed on d1 than c2 might be because sometimes white wants to go d5, and it becomes a little bit harder with the queen being on c2 to go for these sort of pushes. So bishop g2, c5, and now, boom, d5, pushing the pawn. Now, this looks like white is just giving up a pawn. And truth is that white is giving up a pawn, but this is a pawn sacrifice that you can play. And the idea is simply that white is getting a lot of development very quickly, whereas black's pieces are just not as developed. And I mean, white has the initiative. But obviously, as always, when you're giving up a pawn, like you gotta be a little bit careful, right? But the main thing here is also that this diagonal is now going to become pretty weak, and white is basically going to be dominating this diagonal. I mean, this knight is sort of pinned in the sense that could become tricky. Like in the knight moves, sometimes there can be some tactics with this bishop being loose on b7. So Anish castled, bishop e7, and now rook d1. And we can see now that white has a queen, a rook, a bishop, and a knight all active in this position. So, knight c6. Looks like, you know, the knight is hanging, but the idea is that if rook takes d5, then there's knight b4, and this is not hanging. Both the queen and the rook would be attacked. So you cannot capture the knight. Instead, queen f5 was played, a fantastic move. Now the knight is being threatened. I mean, queen takes f5 is a huge threat. And just look, I mean, I love this position for white. I think that I love the fact that white has the initiative. And yeah, this is, even though white is his pawn down, this is slightly better for white. So knight f6, knight went back, and now e4, pushing the pawn and threatening to go perhaps e5. d6, stopping e5, but no, e5 was played anyways, because, I mean, right now the pawn is pinned, so black cannot capture this pawn as the queen would be hanging. So e5 anyways, and this is a great move, and actually, like, white, like, it's slightly better here. And so black played here the only move that is good. I mean, any other move apart from this move loses. So queen d7 was the move. Now, why is this move so important? Well, I mean, where is the knight gonna go? If the knight moves somewhere, then the pawn is going to be hanging, and it's going to be terrible because the queen is on the same file as the rook. So this will become really, really bad. I mean, d7 check is coming as well. So it's crucial for black to exchange queens. Now, white cannot capture this knight because then the queen is going to be hanging. So white needs to exchange here the queens. And then after knight takes, there is pawn takes d6. And now, everybody, it's equal material, but this pawn is just so strong, and it's like really dominating the position. But pawns that are these pushed can sometimes become weak as well. So bishop f6, this bishop is now getting into a really good diagonal. And now rook e1 check, stopping the king from castling, and knight c3, developing a piece and, well, stopping the bishop from looking at b2. In this position, knight b4 was played, with the idea of simply also stopping white from going knight d5. And now knight e5 was played. And well, maybe this wasn't the best move, but I mean, this is a really nice move. The idea of this move is that basically white wants to exchange these bishops. And basically white is saying that if we exchange, then black is gonna have a lot of really weak light squares, like the c6 square, the d5 square. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense that you want to exchange the light squared bishops, I believe. Because also this bishop was being a little bit like not as useful as this bishop was. So I think it makes a lot of sense. So knight takes e5. I mean, you pretty much have to go for this. And then bishop takes b7, taking the bishop. Now the rook is under attack. There's been an exchange of this knight for this bishop. Rook has to move. Rook d8, placing the rook in an active square where the pawn is being threatened. And now rook d1, defending it. Nothing crazy. Just defending it with the rook very nicely. The rook is not really doing much on e1 anyways right now. And now white just needs to get the bishop out. Knight c4, threatening to capture the pawn on d6. If the bishop now would go to f4, then there would be knight takes b2. So the only move to save the pawn pretty much is to go d7. But now that d7 has been played, the king might be able to come in. The king, you know, at some point might be able to get a little bit closer to a pawn, and the pawn, if white is not careful, might fall. But now, everybody, this is the moment where Magnus did, well, he didn't blunder, but it started a series of perhaps like not the greatest moves, which, guys, you know, I am not at all close to the level of Magnus. I mean, you cannot even compare my level. I am 2100. You cannot even compare my level to the level of Magnus. But I just find it fascinating that, you know, the world chess champion can also make mistakes. We can all make mistakes in chess, right? And that is the beauty of chess, that no matter if you're the closest to a chess machine as any human has ever been, you can still make mistakes. And that is the thing that, you know, make chess still as competitive as it is, and makes chess still as fun to watch in higher levels as it is. So it started with Magnus going knight c2, which, I mean, it kind of makes sense. Like, you're threatening the rook and sort of you're trying to reroute the knight to d4. I mean, that is his idea with going knight c2. But the issue is that his whole idea of going knight c2 and knight d4 is just a blunder. The plan is just a bad plan. It's just a blunder. So yeah, and typically what happens a lot of times is that, at least that's what my mom, who's a grandmaster, what she always tells me, she's like, Anna, it's not the one bad move you do in chess, but it's like the series of bad moves you make in a row in chess that makes you lose the game. It's very easy when you do one slightly bad move to just do another one that's really bad. And that's typically what makes you like lose a game of chess, not just like one blunder, unless you like blunder a big piece or something, but you know what I mean. So rook b1 is the only move, but now he went knight d4. And it makes sense that he wants to place like the knight on d4, like the knight looks pretty good here. But the reason why this is bad is because he probably missed that white has this fantastic move, b4. Beautiful move. Now, what is the idea of b4? Well, the idea is that right now, white is threatening to capture this pawn on c5, and if captures, boom, this bishop that didn't look active before when the pawn was on b2 could actually become pretty active at some point on a3 if this knight moved. And it's going to be pretty easy to move this knight as white has a light squared bishop. So this knight is not going to be able to stay here forever. And when the knight moves bishop a3 with the king over here, it's going to become an absolute disaster. So actually the knight is really bad placed here. Now, in this position, if black would go something like pawn takes b4, then after rook takes b4, the knight is hanging. And if the knight moves, then this knight is going to be hanging. I mean, if something like knight d6, for instance, then white can just go first, bishop g2, and there's another pin. There's so many pins right now. Like, the knights just cannot keep up. Like, if rook takes d7, then this knight is going to be hanging. If the knight goes to f5 or something, there's going to be g4 kicking away the knight, and at some point, black will lose material. So black cannot capture on b4, which is why this move is just so fantastic. So in this position, after b4, this is already quite a lot better for white. Magnus made yet another blunder. Once again, it's those like two blunders in a row. I mean, knight c2 wasn't really a blunder, but the whole idea of going knight c2, knight d4 was just in this position not the correct idea. And yeah, and that is just what happened. He went rook takes d7, and this is just like straight up like a blunder. But it makes sense, right? Like this pawn on d7 is so scary. I would want to capture it. It's terrifying. I mean, it's white's passed pawn. It's terrifying. I would also want to capture it. But yeah, rook takes d7 is simply a blunder because of the continuation that Anish did. There's bishop d5, which is the move that I was talking about earlier. You're trying to get rid of this knight over here. This knight, you don't want it to be here because you want to be able to go bishop a3 at some point. But this actually, bishop d5 is the only winning move. So it's important to understand that the moves that Magnus did, they do not work simply because of this exact variation. It's a very critical, like, you know, it's a specific variation. It's not because of anything else. So it just doesn't work tactically for Magnus. So bishop d5, and now the knight has to move somewhere. I mean, b5, you cannot go b5 because if you go b5, then b takes c5, and you're just going to be taking this pawn later on. So the knight has to move. Where does the knight go? Well, the knight went to d6, and now there is pawn takes pawn. You have to take back the pawn, and bishop a3, and this is just so beautiful. The pawn is hanging right now, and there is no way of defending it. It's actually insane. There's not really any way of defending. I mean, if you go something like, for instance, rook c7, then there's going to be rook b8 check. This is another issue in the situation, that the king is so weak. And if you go king e7, then the rook is hanging. And if you go something like, I don't know, knight c8, then there's going to be bishop b7, for instance. Or you can even go, I mean, bishop b7, king e7, knight d5 check. This is just amazing. It's just completely lost. So you just cannot do that. You cannot defend. So after it takes and bishop a3, you cannot defend this pawn. So Magnus went king e7, bishop takes c5. And now we can see that Anish is just completely dominating in this position. Even though it's equal material, Anish pieces are just so much better. The bishop pair is just controlling the whole position. This rook is not active. This knight is weak. The king is just getting checkmated pretty much. It's just really bad. So knight e6 was played here in an attempt to defend the king, and then bishop b4, saving the bishop. And now a5, threatening the bishop, but bishop takes a5. The idea of this was just that Magnus wanted to get a little bit of counterattack and try to get the rook in, putting some pressure on c3 on this knight over here. Then the knight moved to a4. Threat is to go knight b6. It's a fork. Knight c4. Rook c1. Now the threat is to maybe capture on c4. Bishop e5. Bishop check. Where is the king going to go? The king cannot really... I mean, the king just doesn't have a lot of squares to go to. Pretty much the king has to go up to f6. But yeah, even though the queens are not on the board, this is still very scary for the king. And now, everybody, just a fantastic move. Chess.com gives this a brilliant move. Just absolutely beautiful. Knight c5. Anish is just so good. Anish is just so good at chess. Amazing. Knight c5. What is the idea of knight c5? I mean, it's just absolutely beautiful. There's just... The knight has to take on c5 because otherwise this knight is hanging. So the only move is to go knight takes c5. And then there is rook takes c4. So basically you've exchanged, you know, a pair of knights. But now the issue is that this knight is pinned. The knight is pinned. The knight cannot move because the rook is hanging. So you're basically going to be winning a piece. The only move right now to, I mean, you can go knight a6 and give away an exchange, but that's just going to be super lost. The only move is to go rook c7, which Magnus did. And after bishop a5, resignation, everybody. Magnus Carlsen resigned. Why? Because the rook, I mean, is forced to move. Rook d7. And then after this, there's going to be bishop b6. And once again, now the knight is under attack. The knight is pinned, so the knight cannot move. The rook is hanging. And rook c7 is not possible anymore. So black is now losing a piece, and at this level, losing a piece is just lost. You just resign. You don't continue the game. It's just too over to continue. So everybody, this is how Anish Giri beat Magnus Carlsen. Absolutely insane.